Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and we've finally done it. We've arrived at the grand finale for spoiler season for Aether Drift, the very last day. We mostly got the common, uncommon dump today, all of the remaining common and uncommons from the set, but don't let that fool you because there are some spicy cards in the mix that are absolutely going to see standard play and completely turn that format on its head, and I can't wait to talk about those cards. Before we dig in, make sure you like the video if you haven't already, subscribe if you're new, and catch me live Monday through Friday over on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/quarantinecapricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. Also, one last thing before we dig in. Even though spoiler season is coming to an end, I do have a couple of interesting videos on the way. The first of which is going to have my top 10 for the set, in which I discuss my 10 favorite cards, 10 best cards, particularly with standard in mind, but I'll probably make some notes about other formats as well, and talk a little bit about what kind of decks I want to use those cards in, and maybe new deck ideas. But we're just cracking the surface in that video because I have another video coming hot on the heels of that one, which will probably come out Monday or Tuesday, talking about my 10 favorite deck ideas after this set drops in standard, and what I'm looking to do with all of the craziness that's coming in this set. So look forward to those videos. Like I said, subscribe if you're new so that you don't miss out on those. Gonna be some pretty wild, crazy ideas, and I have a feeling a couple of those ideas are actually gonna be insanely relevant to standard in the meta, and I'm super excited to try and get there before anyone else and see if I can crack it before other people realize. So it should be really interesting. But we're going to get to the spoilers. First up today, we have Camera Launcher, a 2/2 artifact creature construct for 3 mana, and it has an exhaust ability where you can pay 3 just once in the entire game, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and also create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. As common filler that can fit in any deck whatsoever. Excuse me. As common filler that can fit in any deck whatsoever, this is actually not too bad. The fact that it gives you value a little bit later on when you have, you run out of gas and you don't have anything to put your mana into, you can make this a little bit beefier, create a colorless flying Thopter token, nice little bit of extra value, and honestly a little bit better than I would expect to see as a common for colorless that you can just sort of splash into whatever deck you need to in order to help fill out the curve. Next up, we've got Guidelight Matrix, an artifact for 2 colorless mana. When this artifact enters, you draw a card. You can also pay 2 mana, tap this, target mount you control becomes saddled until end of turn, or pay 2 mana, tap this, target vehicle you control becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. Honestly, kind of awesome. We've seen eggs like this in the past, where it's a 2 mana artifact that when they enter, they draw you a card. I think this is one of the more substantial abilities we've seen on a card like that, being able to just pay mana to crew or mount your vehicles and mounts for free. Well, I guess not for free, you're paying mana, but without having to worry about having another creature down, without having a creature that can be killed with creature removal and take away your ability to crew and saddle your stuff. This just sits there, your opponent's creature removal is useless against it, and you'll always have the potential to turn those cards on, which is kind of interesting. But I think what makes this actually playable is just the fact that it draws a card when you play it, and that should make it pretty interesting, especially in Limited. But next up, we've got Skybox Ferry, a 4/4 artifact vehicle with flying for 5 mana. That's a lot, but it does crew for only 2, and if you're not at 5, you can just cycle it for 2. This might be an interesting card to use in the cycling deck within Limited, and it's nice that you have the option to just cycle this away and draw a card if you have it early on and you're not anywhere near your 5 mana yet. But at the same time, if you top deck it later on, you get a pretty relevant threat that can actually help you close out the game. And once again, it's a common and colorless, so any deck can kind of splash this in, although the cycling deck's going to get the most value out of it. Next up, we've got Ticket Tortoise. So it hands out tickets. Is it a state trooper? It's a 3/1 artifact creature turtle for 2 mana. It does have defender, so it can't swing. So it's probably going to try to trade with one of your opponent's attacking creatures. And when this creature enters, if an opponent controls more lands than you create a treasure token. Now, what's cool about that is you know this is coming, so you can decide to play this before you play your land for the turn, unless you absolutely need to play it on curve, on turn 2. in a game where I guess it doesn't matter if you're on the play or the draw, right? But regardless, you could play this on turn 3 and then drop your land afterwards, still get the treasure, and then play another 2-drop, which seems pretty interesting. I think this guy's deceptively good, and he's going to end up being a little bit better in practice than people realize at first glance, but you do have to make sure to line him up just right. Next up, we've got Walking Sarcophagus, a 2/1 artifact creature zombie cat for 2 mana with Start Your Engines, so if you're not yet, this will put you at speed 1. When it reaches max speed, it gets +1/+2. Nothing crazy, just becomes a 3/3 for 2, but I think it's important to note that it lines up with a lot of synergies within the limited format. It's a zombie, which is super relevant in limited in this set. It's a cat, which isn't really relevant in limited in this set, but is relevant possibly for standard. I don't necessarily think this will see standard play, but the fact that it's a cat, it's extra. It is a creature type that's relevant. And also the fact that it starts your engines, so if you really need to start your engines, you're desperate, you didn't get a chance to on turn 1, this will start your engines on turn 2 so that you don't stop, so that you don't start missing all of your speed upticks, right, which is incredibly important. You don't want to miss starting your engines early in the decks that care about starting your engines, so really, really important to maybe fill that gap, and it's also a colorless way to do that, so doesn't matter what color deck you're in, you can slam this in as part of your curve and kind of increase the consistency you have of being able to start your engines, which is nice. But next up, we've got Broadcast Rambler, a 5/4 artifact vehicle for 1 white and 4. It accrues for just 1, but also when this vehicle enters, you create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. I actually think this card is really good for a common. You get a 5/4 vehicle for 5, which is a little bit expensive, but it creates its own Thopter token that can then crew the Rambler, since the crew is only 1, which is nice, and even if they kill the Rambler, it leaves behind the 1/1 flying token, which you can get a lot of value out of as the game goes on, especially because it has evasion, right? So if you need to chump block a key flyer to stay alive another turn, or just get in for a ping every turn in the air with it, there's a lot of versatility there, and I kind of like that about this card. But next up, we've got Gallant Strike, an instant for 1 white and 1, destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater, and cycles for 2. So just some extra removal. If you find yourself low on removal in a draft, you can pick this up relatively easily. It is an uncommon, and I think the reason it's an uncommon is that in the cycling archetype in particular, this card's going to be really, really good, because if you don't need to kill a big thing, you can just start triggering all of your cycling payoffs, which is really nice. And I guess even if you're not in the cycling deck, if you just have the ability to cycle this away in situations where you're up against decks that aren't really playing with big creatures that have big toughness, you get that extra versatility. It's never going to be a dead card for you. Yeah, now I'm starting to see it. That makes sense for why it's an uncommon. Pretty good card. But next up, we're gonna talk about Guidelight Synergist. This is a 0/4 artifact robot artificer. Artifact creature robot artificer. Say that 5 times fast. It costs 1 white and 3, it has flying, and it gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. So if you're going wide with artifacts, if you're in that archetype in limited, this guy's nuts. Absolute crazy win condition, comes down as like a 6-7 power flyer, just wins games all by itself, but you gotta specifically be in that archetype to make it worth it. That being said, I guess even outside of that archetype, if you have enough incidental artifacts, which you should if you're playing limited in this set, whether it be like a couple vehicles or whatever the case may be, this is still not nothing, right? If this can just be a 2/4 flyer on average, it's still going to be decent in your deck, I think. So this could make the cut as a card that can block the air pretty decently well, and then eventually maybe actually turn into a win condition, even if your deck isn't super deep into artifacts, just because I think there are enough incidental artifacts in this set, so definitely consider this one. But next up, we've got Leonin Surveyor, a 2/2 cat scout for 1 white and 1. It has Start Your Engines. During your turn, it has First Strike, which isn't dependent upon your speed at all, which is nice. And it also has a max speed ability where you can pay 3 mana and exile this from your graveyard to draw a card. I actually think this card's going to be really, really good in limited, deceptively good. It just does so much that seems like it doesn't maybe matter that much on the surface, but will add up into a lot, I think. Being able to swing with First Strike every single turn is nice. Being able to make sure you're starting your engines early if you don't have a better card to do that with. And then having this extra value with exiling this when you hit max speed to draw a card is actually way better than it looks, because you don't have to worry about like hitting max speed before they get rid of this guy. And if they get rid of it first, you miss out on value. Some of the max speed abilities are that sort of situation where you have to find the right window of hitting max speed while it's still relevant, while it's still on the battlefield, when you can utilize what you gain from max speed. With this, that's not the case. You just trade with it at some point, and it sits there forever, and if at any point in time you happen to get to max speed, well, it's sitting there ready to just draw you a free card, which is kind of awesome. But next up, we've got Lotusguard Disciple, a 2/2 bird cleric with flying for 1 white and 2. When this creature enters, target creature or vehicle gains lifelink and indestructible until end of turn. Pretty nice, although you can't flash it in, so you're not able to use that as a combat trick, which would make it kind of probably broken. So I guess it makes sense for a common especially that this isn't instant speed. But even as just a 2/2 flyer for 3, this is somewhat playable, and being able to get your guy to swing in without having to worry about it dying in combat regardless of the situation and gain some incidental life is really, really nice to help win the race, especially when you know you have a flyer that's going to be able to take that torch and run with it and get in for 2 damage every turn after that and maybe close out the game for you. So pretty interesting little card here. But next up, we've got Sundial Dawn Tyrant. This is the card I've been waiting to see, and I can see why they saved it for last as far as this cycle of creatures is concerned. This is a 3/3 legendary artifact creature construct for 1 white and 1. Full stop. It doesn't have any abilities. It is vanilla. That is because this is the white card in the cycle of legendary creatures that are vanilla with no abilities. But this card in particular is a little bit better than all of the other ones we've seen for a key reason, and that's because it's also an artifact. So even though it's technically vanilla and doesn't have any abilities, just being an artifact is super, super relevant because there are so many artifact synergies within this set that care about artifacts, that give extra value to artifacts or get extra value out of artifacts, that having your 2 mana 3/3 also incidentally be an artifact is not nothing. It's actually very relevant, and depending on the deck you're playing, could be very, very relevant, such as the Affinity for Artifacts deck. So I think this card is really awesome. I'm actually excited to brew with it in Standard. I don't think it's necessarily going to be like the build around or the backbone of an important Standard deck, but I do think it'll be a reasonable addition to some of the crazy Artifact Standard brews that are sure to pop up after this set releases. So I'm excited for this one. I'm glad it's an artifact. The stats are great for the cost, and yeah, this guy's just awesome. But next up, we've got Swiftwing Assailant, a 3/3 bird warrior with flying for 1 white and 3. It starts your engines, and at max speed, it gets +0, +1, and vigilance. Not too bad for a common, honestly. A 3/3 flyer for 4 that at some point will probably be a 3/4 flyer with vigilance that can swing and block every turn should surely help you win races. And this isn't 5 mana, it's 4. I mean, it's still a good chunk of mana, but it's not at a point where you have to wait an insane amount of turns to get to enough mana to play this. Like, this can come down in the mid game pretty easily and just start doing its thing, and then get even better when you hit max speed. It's also a nice backup way of starting your engines. You don't really want to wait until turn 4 to start your engines, but if you haven't been able to in a deck where that's important, at least you have an extra way to make that happen. Next up, we've got Voyager Quickwelder. I'm actually really excited about this one. This is a 2/4 artifact creature robot artificer for 1 white and 2. Artifact spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Full stop. I think this card is nuts. Granted, it's a little bit expensive, right? And at first glance, it seems like it might be too expensive for Standard, and you might be right. That being said, in Limited, it's going to be nuts, and even in Standard, I would argue this has a chance because artifact decks seem like they're just going to be so insane. And because of one other key thing of mentioning, there's other cards in Standard that reduce the cost of artifact spells by 1. So if you're using other cards that do that as well, this is an artifact that also reduces the cost of artifact spells. So theoretically, you could play something that reduces the cost of artifacts, and then play this for only 2 mana as a 2/4 that counts as another artifact for your synergies, and reduces your artifact an additional 1. So you can play even more artifacts out, vomit even more things out of your hand, just empty your hand, all of your artifacts onto the battlefield, and then start fueling things like Affinity for artifacts and crazy ridiculous go-wide artifact synergies. I think this could be nuts. It also has the potential to synergize really well with Simulacrum Synthesizer, which I think is awesome. So yeah, I just think there's a lot going for this, and there is a chance it's too expensive and it's not good enough for standard, and for sure we're going to have to test it out and see if it ends up being good enough, but I think it at least has the potential, and regardless of that, I think it's going to be great in limited. But next up, we've got Gearseeker Serpent. We are moving on to blue. This is a 5/6 creature serpent for 2 blue and 5, and it has affinity for artifacts. It also has an ability to pay 1 blue and 5. This creature can't be blocked this turn. I think this card is really good top-end win condition for the affinity for artifacts limited deck. This one in particular probably a little bit missing the mark when it comes to a standard affinity for artifacts deck. I can't believe I just said standard and affinity for artifacts in the same sentence. I'm a little worried. We're absolutely going to brew it, though, because that deck's going to be insane. I don't know if this makes the cut in standard, because of one key thing. It doesn't count as an artifact itself. So you have to be very, very careful about how many payoffs you can actually add to your deck that aren't artifacts themselves. There are a couple affinity for artifacts cards that are artifacts themselves, and those are the cards you really want to double down on. There's still potential that it could possibly be one of the payoffs that you're trying to get to with that deck in standard, but I have a feeling it's just going to be a little bit out of reach. That being said, in the limited deck, if you're going wide with artifacts and trying to abuse artifacts to the maximum limit, this card is absolutely some of your insane payoff. Getting a 5/6 for as little as just 2 mana, and then having the ability to make it unblockable every turn if you just need to close out the game. It does take a lot of mana to do it, but we've also seen a lot of cards in this set that give you incidental mana that you can use only for activated abilities, and this could be another good sync for that, so it'll be interesting to see just how good this actually ends up being. But next up, we've got Glitch Ghost Surveyor, a 2/2 with flying for 1 blue and 2. It has Start Your Engines, and at max speed, you can pay 3 and exile this from your graveyard to draw a card. So just like the other card that did this, this card is also good for the same reasons. Comes down, starts swinging in the air, you can race your opponent. It's going to be really good and limited for that reason. It starts your engines if you haven't been able to yet, and then just if you incidentally reach max speed later at any point when this is in your graveyard, you can just draw a card off of it, which is awesome. I think this card is actually really, really good. Probably one of the better commons in the set, to be honest, at least for limited. But next up, we've got Guidelight Optimizer. This is a 2/1 artifact creature robot for 1 blue and 1. You can tap it to add a blue mana, but spend this mana only to cast an artifact spell or activate an ability. This set is so insane with both artifacts and activated abilities that I think this card is kind of going to be nuts. And it's not even necessarily below rate on power for its mana either. If you need to trade this, you can trade this for most of your opponent's 2-drops easily. Even if they're playing some of their better 2-drops that are like 3/2s, this will still trade for it relatively easily. So the fact that you have something for 2 mana that can trade with your opponent's 2-drops, that counts as an artifact for those synergies, and can tap to make mana for your artifacts, or for any activated ability even if it's not on an artifact, like your exhaust abilities, this guy is incredibly versatile. You can probably put him in the exhaust deck or the artifact deck, or a deck that is maybe using some kind of hybrid with both of those mechanics in the same deck. The sky's really the limit for a card like this. I actually think it's going to end up being super, super good and limited. But next up, we've got Keen Buccaneer, a 2/3 octopus pirate with vigilance for 1 blue and 2. It has exhaust, pay 1 blue and 1, draw a card, discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Honestly, not too bad. A 2/3 vigilance for 3 is a little bit underrated, but at the same time, it is a common, right? And if you do get to use its exhaust ability, which is pretty cheap and not too hard to use, now you have a 3/4 that still has the vigilance, and you got to loot for like the card that you need. Obviously that's going to be better in decks that want things in the graveyard, but even outside of that, I think this is fine, and this thing will probably show up filling in people's curve as a late pick in draft more often than not. Next up, we've got Memory Guardian. Probably my pick for the best blue card. No, this is not the best blue card we saw today. Scratch that, we're getting to it. But this is definitely very, very high up there. This is a 3/4 artifact creature robot artificer for 1 blue and 4, which seems expensive even though it has flying, except it has affinity for artifacts. So this is absolutely the payoff for affinity for artifacts for standard that we were talking about earlier. That other card probably doesn't make the cut because it takes at the very least 2 blue mana to play. Doesn't have evasion. This only takes at most 1 mana to play, or at least 1 mana to play, has evasion in the form of flying, and counts as an artifact itself. That's the most important part. So you don't have to worry about fitting this in and going down on the number of artifacts you have in your deck to turn on all your artifact synergies. This contributes to your artifact synergies while also capitalizing on all of the artifact synergies you've already built up. If you can slam this for just 1 blue mana and get a 3/4 flyer that gives you even more value for all of your artifact synergies, that's just bananas. This is absolutely going to see play in standard. This is going to be one of the important on-curve cards in the Affinity for Artifacts deck for sure. And in Limited, it's going to be nuts. In Limited, this guy is crazy and going to be a very high pick if you know you're going for that deck archetype. Just an awesome card. Affinity is back. And I don't know if that's a good thing, but I'm excited to at least find out. Next up, we've got Nimble Thopterist, a 3/2 Vedalken Artificer for 1 blue and 3. And when it enters, you create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. This isn't like insanely good or anything, it's just kind of curve filler. But that being said, it is a little bit better than it looks on the surface, because not only does that Thopter have flying and gives you a little bit of evasion in the form of these 2 different bodies for 4 mana, which is already kind of good, but it counts as an artifact. So all those artifact synergies we've been talking about this whole time, this is a way to get another artifact onto the board, even though the card itself is not an artifact, which is pretty interesting. Next up, we've got Sabotage Strategist, a 2/2 Vedalken Ranger with flying and vigilance for 2 blue and 2. Whenever 1 or more creatures attack you, those creatures get -1/-0 until end of turn, and it has an exhaust ability. For 2 blue and 5, you put 3 +1/+1 counters on this creature. This card is actually nuts. The more you think about this card, the crazier it is. I don't necessarily think it's made for standard or constructed at all, and I don't know if it's usable in that format. But in Limited, this guy is absolutely insane. Even though it's a 2/2 flying vigilance, you gotta kinda count it like it's a 2/3 flying vigilance. Because if your opponent's attacking you and you're blocking with this, that attacking creature gets -1/-0. So it attacks, if it has 3 power, it attacks like it has 2 power, right? So if it has 2 power, it attacks like it has 1. So you can block a 2 power creature with this all day. And then the rest of your field can actually block things they normally wouldn't be able to block without trading as well, or chump blocking, or whatever the case may be. So because of that, I think this guy ends up being deceptively good. Even though that -1/-0 seems kind of negligible, it's going to really, really matter if you have decent blockers. It makes them rethink how you're going to block, and even if you don't have blockers, anything that does get through for damage that you do let through is going to do 1 less damage, and all of that is awesome. But the fact that this can block their 2 power creatures in the air, also swing in the air and get through for evasive damage, do both of those things every turn cycle because of the vigilance, and nerf your opponent's board, and eventually become a 5/5 flying vigilance win condition, all of that just seems awesome. And granted, you need an awful lot of mana to activate that exhaust ability, but Like I said before, there are plenty of ways in this set to generate extra mana that you can only use towards activated abilities, and this is a really good target for that. And even if you don't have extra mana, just something that you can eventually mana sink your stuff into when you do get to 7 lands is still pretty decent as extra gravy. So I just think all around this guy is way better than he looks on the surface in Limited, and he's going to end up being a very high pick once people realize that. But next up, we've got Scrounging Skyray, and this is probably my pick for the best blue card we've seen all day, and probably one of the best commons or uncommons in the entire set. This is a 1/2 flying fish pirate for 1 blue and 1. It has flying, like I said, but also, whenever you discard 1 or more cards, you put that many +1/+1 counters on this creature, and then if that wasn't enough, it also cycles for 2. Now, we've already seen a red 1-drop in this set that has the same ability that gets a +1/+1 counter every single time you discard 1 or more cards. And the key thing to note about that ability is you get a +1/+1 counter for, you get that many +1/+1 counters. You get 1 for every single card discarded. A lot of times, abilities like this are worded in a way where if multiple things happen at the same time, you still only get 1. If multiple cards are discarded at the same time, you just get the 1 trigger and the 1 counter. This is not worded that way because it says put that many +1/+1 counters on this creature. And the red 1-drop has the same wording, so both of these cards are the backbone of your creature base for an insane cycling self-discard deck that is absolutely going to make a splash in the standard meta as soon as this set is legal. And it's kind of nuts that this one has evasion. Just stacking up a ton of +1/+1 counters, whether it be by playing cards that wheel your whole hand, or just constantly cycling everything in your deck, is going to be nuts by itself. This having flying and making all of those +1/+1 counters matter that much more because you have evasion is pretty bananas. The fact that you trigger all of your other discard triggers as you are cycling things and discarding things to get your counters is nuts as well. And we've seen some other really amazing payoffs for discarding cards in this set. So I think that deck's just going to be absolutely bananas. And then on top of all of that, if you top deck this later on in the game where you've already got your win conditions out, your payoffs out, and you're just trying to close out the game, it's another card that can just be cycled away. Instead of kind of being dead and getting it too late for it to be relevant, you just cycle it away, get another trigger on all of your discard payoffs, and keep going ham. Draw into another card that can maybe cycle as well. Just insanity. This card is nuts. I can't believe they printed it. The cycling deck is going to be bananas. I'm telling you right now. I'm telling you right now. The meta is going to get ripped apart by that cycling deck. Pixie decks, nurturing pixie decks, aren't even going to exist anymore because if they come up against this deck, they just auto lose. It's going to be so wild. I can't wait to dig in. I could go on and on about this card and about that deck, but I'll save that for the next video where we talk about, you know, not the next video, but the one after that where we talk about the 10 decks I'm looking forward to brew, because you bet your ass this deck's going to be one of them. But we're going to move on. Next up, we've got Skystreak Engineer, a 1/3 human pilot with flying for 1 blue and 1, and it has an exhaust ability where you can pay 1 blue and 4 to put 2 +1/+1 counters on this creature. Not bad, honestly. A 1/3 flyer on 2 that can kind of hold down the fort, be somewhat defensive until you can get to the rest of your plays is pretty decent, and then later on in the game, when you don't have anything left to play, you can just jam that 5 mana and turn it into a 3/5 flyer. That seems really good. I actually like this guy a lot in Limited. I think he's going to be a decently high pick. But next up, we've got Spectral Interference, an instant for 1 blue and 1, counter target artifact or creature spell unless its controller pays 4. I think within Limited, this card's actually going to be one of the better counter spells we've seen in a while. 4 is a lot of mana. Being able to hit any creature or any artifact in a set like this that is super wide with artifacts is incredibly important. The real question is, will this see play in Standard? There is a chance this shows up in sideboards, and it really depends on how crazy and how prevalent the artifact decks end up being in that format. I'm excited to find out. But next up, we've got Spell Pierce. Speaking of counter spells and sideboards, An instant for 1 blue mana, counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2. Full stop. This is going to shake up the standard meta for sure. Being able to stop on curve plays very efficiently for only 1 mana is incredibly important, and I'm most excited to see this card against like the mono red prowess decks that are everywhere on the ladder right now, because countering, you know, a key buff spell that's trying to buff up their slick shot or one of their mice or whatever could be super important. I don't know until we see those games play out and really get a sense of how impactful that ends up being on sort of putting a roadblock in front of mono red, but the potential is definitely there, and I would not be surprised to see Spell Pierce show up in a lot of sideboards. But next up we've got Stall Out, a sorcery for 1 blue and 1. Tap target creature or vehicle, then put 3 stun counters on it. I love this. This is very similar to a card we got a while ago, and I can't remember the name of that card. But it functionally did pretty much the same thing, except didn't hit a vehicle. But this one ends up being a little bit better in that you can cycle it away. So a card that early in the game locks out their best thing from being able to swing at you and close out the game for a whopping three turns, while also having the ability to cycle this in the late game to, you know, maybe trigger your discard payoffs, or maybe just because it's not useful to you and you draw another card and dig closer to your bomb that can close out the game for you. Lots of interesting possibilities with a card like this. I love that it has cycling. But next up we've got Trip Up. Man, the blue cards just never end today. This is an instant for 1 blue and 3. Target non-land permanent's owner puts it on their choice of the top or bottom of their library, and also has cycling for 2. As instant speed removal in blue that just gets rid of it to the top or bottom of the library. Honestly, really like this. Putting it in their library is way better than bouncing it, and then having the extra versatility of just cycling this away if it's not good enough, it's not what you need in order to draw another card, is also pretty nice. But next up we have our first black card of the day, Ancient Vendetta, a sorcery for 1 black and 3. Choose a card name, search target opponent's graveyard, hand, and library for up to 4 cards with that name, and exile them. That player shuffles. Now, the reason this is an uncommon is because 4 mana is a lot, especially because it doesn't impact the board whatsoever, right? We already have a sweeper in standard for 5 mana that can sweep the board and still exile something from the graveyard and then get rid of every copy of that. What I think makes this card a little bit better than people might realize is the fact that when you hit things in their hand, they don't get to redraw cards to replace those cards that you hit in their hand, which is incredibly relevant. Most of the cards we've seen with this ability in the past, if you hit something out of their hand, they get to redraw cards to replace it. This one doesn't do that. So even if you play like a Duress earlier in the game and you notice they have like 2 Atraxas in their hand, if you have any ways to look at their hand and know what they have, you can name Atraxa, and not only are all of their Atraxas gone from their graveyard, their library, they're never going to be able to play one for the rest of the game, but you also get a couple cards out of their hand, and they don't get to redraw to replace those. And I think that that is actually more powerful than it appears on the surface, and gives this card a fighting chance to be an actual sideboard option in Standard. I would not be surprised, especially with some of the crazy ramp decks we've seen going around, where they have very specific cards they need to ramp into in order to actually win the game. There are some combo decks involving Omniscience. You could get rid of all of your opponent's Omnisciences. That seems super powerful. So yeah, because of where the meta's at, and there are some key decks this will absolutely destroy, I do think it has a chance of seeing sideboard play for sure. But next up we've got Chitin Gravestalker, a 5/4 insect warrior for 1 black and 5, which is super expensive, but it costs 1 less to cast for each artifact and or creature card in your graveyard, and also has cycling too. So if things line up really well for you, you could play this for as little as just 1 black mana and get a 5/4, which is awesome. And because there's so many cycling cards in this set, it's actually kind of easy to just cycle away your artifacts and creatures to redraw cards, dig for your bombs, and in the process, start to get rid of the mana cost for this so that you eventually get to just play it for 1 mana. And I think that's worth noting, because in any other set, this wouldn't be quite as good. But in this set, there's a lot more you can do to set it up to get that mana advantage, and I kind of love that about it. And even if you don't need a 5/4 on the battlefield, or you're not in a position where you can wait to set up that kind of cost reduction, you can just cycle this away as well and get your discard payoffs, get more things in the yard, maybe for another one that you draw into later, and for other synergies that care about the graveyard. So pretty interesting versatility here. It is a bit expensive at its base cost, but I still think it's worth seeing play. Next up, we've got Engine Rat, a 1/1 zombie rat with Death Touch for 1 black mana, but also you can pay 1 black and 5, and each opponent loses 2 life. I kind of love this. Early game, it just shuts down your opponent's good creatures from swinging because they don't want you to trade it for your Engine Rat. And then late game, you have this mana sink that just wins the game all by itself. And it's like, if you don't attack with your bomb, I'll just keep draining you every turn. But if you do attack with your bomb, I'll just block it and kill it. And I also love the fact that it's a relevant creature type in being a zombie. It's also a rat. Honestly, this might see play in the rats deck, just because it's a 1/1 rat for 1. And that deck can go really crazy, the standard version of rats, just based off how many cheap rats you can get out quickly and efficiently. So this might even see play in that deck. But it's also a zombie, which is super relevant for limited. So yeah, I think this card is just awesome. But next up, we've got Grim Javelineer, a 3/2 human warrior for 1 black and 2. Whenever you attack, target attacking creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and when that creature dies this turn, you surveil 1. Pretty interesting. I think what I like about this card is it's not super understated for its cost. It still has 3 power, which like isn't amazing, but at least it's still a relevant body for the 3 mana that you're playing. And what really makes this card worth considering is the fact that you don't have to attack with the Javelineer. You can attack with literally anything, and it's still going to trigger the Javelineer's ability, and you'll get to attack with an extra point of power and surveil 1 if it dies. So a little bit of extra value there. I think that makes this card a little bit better than it looks on the surface. Still nothing amazing, but absolutely worth playing to fill out your curve if you pick it up a little bit later on in the draft. Next up, we've got Hellish Sideswipe. 1 black mana for a sorcery. As an additional cost, you have to sacrifice an artifact or creature. Destroy target creature or vehicle. If the sacrifice permanent was a vehicle, you draw a card. I think this card's going to be super good in limited. One of the premier pieces of removal, simply because you can sack a vehicle and replace the card that you sack by drawing a card. Sometimes you want to do that regardless of the fact that you want to be able to cheaply remove something on their side. So having that built in is going to be really, really nice for the decks that are go wide with vehicles, using a ton of vehicles. This is just insane removal for that deck. But even in standard, I think this might find a home. We've actually seen a few different cards that make vehicle tokens, and if you're able to sacrifice a very negligible vehicle token, or maybe a very cheap vehicle that had some kind of ETB value, of which we've seen a few of those, draw a card after already getting your value, and sacrificing something negligible and still removing the best threat on the other side for just 1 mana, could be kind of amazing. That being said, in standard, you do have to use it in just the right deck where all of the value pays off for you in all of the right ways, or else this is kind of just eh. But I guess even if you're just in some kind of a sacrifice aristocrat style build, having to sacrifice a thing isn't that bad, because you only have to pay 1 mana. I think there's a real chance for this in standard. Definitely the deck that is going wide with vehicles might consider this as their prime source of removal for their removal package. But even in decks that just have some vehicles you might want to sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice aristocrat style deck where you can sacrifice artifacts or creatures and get extra value regardless of whether it's a vehicle, this could end up being pretty good. I don't know. This is one of those cards you definitely have to test out to see how good it ends up being. But the potential is there for sure. And in limited, if you're in the go wide vehicle deck, especially if you're making a bunch of vehicle tokens, this card's going to be a slam dunk. Next up, we've got Locust Spray. 1 black mana for an instant. Target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, and it cycles for just 1 black mana. The best part about this card is simply that it cycles for 1 mana. That makes this card really, really good in the discard decks, but also the fact that you can use it early on as incidental removal. They happen to drop a decent creature that only has 1 toughness, and then you just take it out for 1 mana. That can be pretty good. Most of the time, though, you're just going to want to cycle this for 1 and trigger all of your, self-discard payoffs, which is going to be really good on its own. Next up, we've got Mutant Surveyor, a 2/3 Mutant Scout for 1 black and 2. It has Start Your Engines. When it reaches max speed, you can exile it from your graveyard to draw a card by paying 3. But before that happens, while it's on the battlefield, you can pay 2 mana to give it +1/+1 till end of turn for each 2 mana that you pay, which is important to note. It's not limited to once per turn. And like I said before, there are ways in this set to generate extra mana that can only be used for activated abilities. So that is a little bit better than it looks on the surface. But again, just like all of the cards we've seen from this cycle that, draw you a card from the graveyard if you hit max speed, I think this is pretty decent free value in the decks that can get to max speed eventually, even if those decks aren't necessarily trying to get to max speed as soon as possible. So, yeah, I like this whole cycle, I think. But next up, we've got Risky Shortcut. 1 black and 2, draw 2 cards, each player loses 2 life. Granted, it's sorcery speed, which is a little bit of a bummer, but still, drawing 2 cards and they lose 2 life in addition to you is pretty good. Normally, a card that does this just makes you lose 2 life, full stop. But having them have to lose life as well makes this way, way better. It means if you're in any kind of aggressive deck whatsoever that's just trying to close the game out as quickly as possible, it's just sheer upside, because it's basically like you both started the game at 18 life instead of 20. And in an aggro deck where you're just trying to kill them as quick as possible, making them start at 18 life, you kind of don't care if you're at 18, right? So getting to draw 2 cards while also reducing their life total is super, super important, and makes the fact that you lose life way, way, way less relevant than it otherwise might be. I think this card is actually going to be really, really good. I'm going to play it. Next up, we've got Spin Out, an instant for 2 black and 1, destroy target creature or vehicle. This is basically murder, except you don't have to wait for their vehicle to be crewed to get rid of it, which is a nice little bit of upside. But the fact that it's instant speed removal in general definitely makes this playable in Standard. It's going to be super good there. In Limited, it's going to be super good there. In Standard, it will not see play, because power creep is a thing, and 3 mana removal is too much, and everyone's using 2 mana removal now, and that's just the way it goes. Which is sad. It's really, really sad, to be honest, that power creep has gone that far. But I mean, it is what it is. Next up, we've got Syphon Fuel. 1 black and 4 for an instant. Target creature gets -6/-6 until end of turn, and you gain 2 life. This is super expensive. I don't even care that you gain life, because it's super expensive. Sure, it's instant speed. Sure, you gain 2 life. Sure, you can kill something with as much of as a 6 toughness. But it's 5 mana. I mean, don't get me wrong, we're still going to play this. One of these will probably make the cut in any deck that's a little light on their removal suite and just needs to fill in their removal suite. But I'm not going to like it. I'm not going to like having to play it. That being said, it's fine. It's splashable as well, which is important to note. It only takes the 1 black mana, so it could be in your splash color and just have that little bit of extra removal in your deck. It'll make the cut if you're running low on removal towards the end of a draft and you need to pick up some removal. So, yeah. Next up is Wreckage Wickerfolk, and my dog continues to snore. I don't know if you guys can hear that in the background. Kind of sounds like a Hoover going off every now and then. But he is a snory boy. Hey, Bandit. Bandit, are you sleepy? Yeah, now you hear me. Now you're waking up. I'm going to finish the video, okay? Alright, this is Wreckage Wickerfolk. A 1/3 artifact creature scarecrow with flying for 1 black and 1. And when this creature enters, you surveil 2. I really like this card. Like I said before, on a similar 1/3 flyer for 2, it can just come down and hold off aggro pretty decently, even if they're swinging with flyers, which is nice. But you have some extra value in this card where it counts as an artifact, which is going to be super relevant in this set, and you get this incidental ability to surveil 2, which, if you want to put things in the graveyard, is going to be really good. But even if you don't want to put things in the graveyard, just getting to basically scry 2 and make sure you're digging that much closer to the next land drop you need to make, or the color that you're missing, or the bomb that you're trying to dig for, or whatever the case may be, is actually way more powerful than it might appear at first glance. So I actually think this card's going to be really good. If you're playing the artifact deck that gets tons of payoffs for going wide with artifacts, this is going to be a no-brainer, I think, and should be a pretty decently easy thing to grab a little bit later in the draft, too. Next up, we've got red. This is Burner Rocket, a 3/1 artifact vehicle with flash for 1 red and 1. And when this vehicle enters, target creature you control gets +2/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. And then as a vehicle, this crews for just 1. This is another one of those cards that would be a good option to sacrifice to that card we saw earlier, where you get to, for 1 mana, kill whatever you want and draw a card if you sack a vehicle. Because it gets you value when you play it. You flash it in the middle of combat, use it as a trick to get value, to kill a thing that they didn't think you were going to be able to kill when they block, or maybe when they attack in. But if you're attacking, it's even better because you get the trample. So not only do you probably kill their thing without them seeing it coming, but also you trample through for extra damage, which is nice. And then you just have value that sticks on the battlefield. If you've got a 1/1 token somewhere, you can just turn this into a 3/1, block their 3/3, and trade up really, really efficiently and still have your 1/1 left around to get you more value later on in the game. Or just swing in with this every turn by tapping your 1/1, whatever the case may be. I actually think because this specifically has flash, there's a lot of value to be had by this card. And I think it's going to be really good. I think it's going to be a lot better than most of the commons. It's still not going to be anything insane that you like first pick or anything. It's not going to be a high pick at all. But I think it's going to end up being a little bit better than it looks in practice, just because of giving you that extra value that sticks around forever, but also being a combat trick. I really like this card. But next up, we've got Dynamite Diver. This is a 1/1 Goblin Pilot for just 1 red mana, and it saddles, mounts, and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater, and when this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. This is like the best Mog Fanatic we've ever seen. Just incidentally being able to deal a damage when it dies, not having to sacrifice it to do it, means you can trade with something in combat and then still ping and kill something else, which is awesome. It's what I always used to do with Mog Fanatic back in the day before they changed the way combat works and got rid of putting combat damage on the stack. You used to be able to put damage on the stack and then sack your guy to get his ability, and the combat damage would still happen, which was amazing. This is basically the version of Mog Fanatic how it used to be with the old rules. You can still kind of do that. I mean, you don't get to do the damage to whatever you want, whenever you want, through a sacrifice activation, but still, even that might be a little bit better in some decks, because if you're playing this in like an Aristocrat style deck or sacrifice deck, you can get your other sacrifice payoff for this without having to sacrifice it to get the 1 damage, and then still incidentally get that 1 damage, which I think is awesome. So when you take into account the fact that this is a goblin, which is going to be a super relevant creature type in the new standard, and it's got the pilot ability of crewing and mounting things way easier, and it gives you that extra value of pinging something without actually having to trigger that ping. You can use it for sacrifice stuff, you can trade in combat, that sort of thing. It's a lot of value packed into one card, to be completely honest. I really like it. I'm fumbling over my words a lot, but that's because I'm tired and there are a lot of cards to get through. But I think this guy's actually really awesome. Next up, we've got Endrider Spikespitter, a 3/4 human mercenary with reach for 1 red and 3. It has start your engines, and at max speed, at the beginning of your upkeep, you exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. This card's actually super good. I mean, it's not quite there for standard. It's going to be too slow for standard. But in limited, this is nuts. A 3/4 for reach is already pretty decent for 4. Can help hold down the fort, drag the game on until you can get to some of your more bomby plays. But the fact that the card that's doing that can also, when you happen to incidentally reach max speed, just basically draw you an extra card every single turn. Granted, you have to use that card that turn, but in limited, that shouldn't be too tough. Just play the thing that you exiled and save the thing that you draw. And I love that. So I think this card's actually going to be really, really good. And the reach seems super relevant because we have seen a lot of flying, a lot of Thopter tokens and stuff like that. So in this set in particular, I think the reach matters more than it might in other sets. So the more I think about this card, the more I like it. absolutely a card advantage engine kind of in any deck, to be honest, because you can incidentally get to max speed kind of easily throughout the course of the game. You just can't get there super fast incidentally. There are definitely going to be some decks that are meant to get there super fast, and this will be good in that as well. But even in just any casual deck, I think you can incidentally get to max speed, you know, relatively consistently at a later turn. And this is just free card advantage, so that seems awesome. But next up, we've got Lightning Strike. Yes, Lightning Strike is back. We're stuck with it for another 3 years in Standard. Yay! Thank you, Wizards. Next up is Magmakin Artillerist, a 1/4 elemental pirate for 1 red and 2. Whenever you discard 1 or more cards, this creature deals that much damage to each opponent. So here's one of our self-discard cycling payoffs, which is awesome, especially in conjunction with all the other payoffs that we have coming for that deck. Kind of insane that we have another one now. It also cycles for 1 red and 1 itself, so if you get to a point where you're just trying to close out the game, you don't need to set up any more payoffs, you just need to keep the cycling train going. You can cycle this as well. And when you cycle this card, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, so you even get a little bit of extra value out of it in that way, even in situations where you're not going to commit it to the board and you're just going to keep cycling it away. And I kind of love that about this card. This is probably the best 2-mana cycle card that we've seen so far, in that it gives you this little bit of incidental value. Although, there was that one rare where you can pay X and kill an artifact or Chim, and technically, I guess that cycles for 2, right? That's probably better than this. But still, this card's bananas, and it's absolutely going to see play in those decks. Next up, we've got Road Rage. I almost said Road Rash. Anybody remember that game on Sega Genesis? That was a good time. This is an instant for 1 red mana. It deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, where X is 2 plus the number of mounts and vehicles you control. So, in the Mountain Vehicle deck, this is an auto-include. You're going to draft this super high, 1 mana, at instant speed, kill pretty much whatever you want, as long as you've gone wide with enough mounts and vehicles, which if you're in that deck, that's what you should be doing. But what's cool about this card is even outside of that deck, it's going to be pretty good. If you just incidentally get a mount or a vehicle onto the battlefield, this just lightning bolt your creature. You just need one. You just need one vehicle or mount. And there's so many vehicles and mounts in this set, I can't think... there's no way that every deck isn't at least incidentally running at least a couple, right? Even if you're not super deep into going mounts and vehicles, you're gonna have some. So a shock that can incidentally sometimes just be a lightning bolt, granted it can't hit the head, but I think that's the least relevant part about this card. I think, you know, being able to kill whatever with 2 toughness, and then sometimes if you just get one mount or vehicle down, you know, lightning bolting your opponent's creature is bananas. If you happen to get a second, it turns into 4 damage for 1 still at instant speed, which is nuts. But like I said, in the mount or vehicle deck, this is going to be a slam dunk auto-include. You're going to have to draft it high because so many decks, even outside of that deck, are still going to want this card. So if you are in that deck, make sure you grab it while it's there because it will not table, I guarantee you. But next up, we've got Sky Crash. This is an instant for 1 red and 1, destroys an artifact, cycles for 1 red mana. This is a nice way of including incidental artifact removal in your limited deck without wasting a card if you don't have an artifact to kill. That being said, there are plenty of artifacts in this set, so very rarely will you not have a decent artifact to kill. Excuse me. It cycles for just 1 red mana though. That is the best part about this card, hands down. Just keep the train going in the cycling deck, and that makes this card awesome. But next up, we've got Thunderhead Gunner, a 4/5 shark. God damn. A 4/5 shark pirate with reach for 1 red and 4. Discard a card, draw a card, activate only as a sorcery and only once each turn. This is an awesome enabler for the discard decks that have a bunch of discard payoffs. It's another way to trigger that stuff for free. If you spend all of your mana cycling everything, and you have more stuff you want to discard to draw, but you just don't have the mana to pay the cycling cost, you get to basically do another cycle for free once a turn, on your turn specifically, and get those discard triggers, but also draw another card deeper into your deck. And getting all of that on the back of a relevant creature that's a 4/5 reacher that you can splash because it's just 1 red and 4, all of that's kind of nice. It's not like the most insane card ever. You're not going to pick it high or anything like that, but you'll probably grab one of these towards the end of the draft and use it to help flesh out your curve and be... I don't see you using maybe more than one of these in your limited deck, but I could see a world where at least one of these makes it into your draft deck for sure. Next up, we've got green, Alacrian Jaguar. This is a 4/4 cat mount with vigilance for 1 green and 4. Whenever this creature attacks while saddled, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and you saddle it for just 1. I actually think this card's pretty good for a common. It's still a little overcosted, but I mean, it's a common, it's splashable, it gets, you know, buffed up into a 6/6 vigilance when you saddle it. That being said, it can't ever be a 6/6 on the block, and that's something to keep in mind that's very easy to overlook. You can saddle it on your turn, swing as a 6/6, but then the vigilance letting you block with it means it's only going to block as a 4/4 because you can only saddle on your own turn. So don't forget about that. That makes this card a little bit worse than it might otherwise be, but still absolutely runnable in the right deck. Next up, we've got Broken Wings. 1 green and 2 for an instant. Destroy an artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. This is a reprint. This is a staple to most decks, most formats, and available as a decent limited play. But I think a card like this is better in a set like this because you have so many more targets to hit, so many more artifacts in specific. But being able to kill creatures with flying are pretty relevant as well, and there are some good enchantments, so this will definitely make the cut as a decent sideboard pick in best of 3 limited, but even in best of 1, this might make the cut in your main deck. We'll have to wait and see. Next up, we've got Fang Guardian, a 4/2 ape druid with flash for 1 green and 3, and when it enters, another target creature or vehicle you control gets +2/+2 until end of turn. I actually think this guy is really, really good. Instant speed 4 power creature for 4 mana is already pretty decent. You can trade up with 4/4s or 5/4s pretty easily and add instant speed where they don't see it coming. But the fact that you get to use it as a combat trick as well, buff up one of your other dudes so that you kill their guy in combat but don't die yourself, while also having access to the 4/2 trick to trade up with one of their big creatures, seems kind of awesome. And if you need to, you can use this on attacks as well as a combat trick. Although I think this is going to be a lot better on blocks because of the 4/2 body. But there's versatility there in how you can use it. Just getting a 4 power creature for 4 mana at instant speed is honestly pretty decent by itself. So I really like this card. I like that you have the potential to completely blow out your opponent. It'll absolutely see play unlimited. But next up, we've got Elvish Refueler. This is a 2/3 elf druid for 1 green and 2, and during your turn, as long as you haven't activated an exhaust ability this turn, you may activate exhaust abilities as though they haven't been activated. And it has an exhaust ability itself where you pay 1 green and 1 to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So the floor of this, at the very least, you get a 2/3 for 3 that every single turn you can pay 2 mana to put a counter on it, which honestly isn't that bad, especially when you take into account the fact that there are cards in this set that generate extra mana for you that you can only use for activated abilities. It might not be as expensive as paying that 2 mana, but the ceiling on this card is bananas because we've seen a lot of crazy exhaust abilities, especially for the rares and mythics, that they're exhaust abilities for a reason. They're meant to be used once in the entire game for a reason because they're super, super powerful. So the fact that you get to use those abilities once a turn instead of once per game is absolutely bananas. Now, granted, you can only do 1 exhaust ability each turn as though it hasn't been activated before. So it has to be the first one you activate, and once you do, you can't reuse any of your other exhaust abilities. Just once per turn, and your opponent could kill this as soon as you play it before you really get to use the value. That being said, if you're holding up enough mana to reuse an exhaust ability that's really powerful, you can jam this, and even if they use instant speed removal to kill it right away, you can respond by using that exhaust ability and still getting some value out of this by using an ability you otherwise wouldn't have been able to use for a second turn, which I think makes this a little bit more powerful than it otherwise would be. So there's definitely some interesting stuff you can do with this. I think some of the exhaust decks are going to be utterly broken, and you might want to consider running this even in standard. But I have a feeling at the end of the day, this might be a little too slow for standard. No matter what, it's going to be nuts in limited, especially in the decks that focus on exhaust abilities. Completely bananas. But next up, we've got Hazard of the Dunes. This is a 4/4 creature worm with trample and reach for 1 green and 3. It has an exhaust ability where you pay 1 green and 6 to put 3 +1/+1 counters on this creature. This is actually a really good card. A 4/4 trample reach for 4 is already pretty good, especially considering the fact that you can grab this just as a common, incidentally, pretty easily in a draft. But the ability to just ramp up into a crazy win condition later on in the game when you have the mana is nuts. I think this is going to be one of the best green commons specifically. And every green deck's probably going to want to run one of these, I think. 4/4 trample reach for 4 with extra value that's just a win condition is nuts in my opinion. I think this is one of the better cards for limited. This card's crazy. But next up, we've got Ghibberich Omnivore. I kind of just want to call it gibberish. Ghibberich Omnivore, a 3/2 creature beast for 1 green and 1. It's pretty good, and it shows you how far. I'm sorry. I've been going for like an hour. This is a long video, and I am slurring my words. It shows you how far power creep has come. That a 3/2 for 2 is just a common, right? There was once a time when getting 3 power for 2 mana was considered insane. And now we just get it, whatever, as your run-of-the-mill, not-so-great common. That being said, there are ways in which this isn't as good as other cards in the set, and it makes sense to be a common because it is just a beast. It doesn't have a relevant creature type. It doesn't count as an artifact or anything like that, so it doesn't get any of those extra kind of built-in silver lining values in any way. It's just a beast, but still, a 3/2 for 2 is pretty relevant in my opinion. Next up, we've got Migrating Ketradon. I almost said Ketradon, like Michael Keaton. I don't know why. I'm tired, guys. We gotta get through this video. This is a 6/6 dinosaur with reach for 2 green and 4. When this creature enters, you gain 4 life, and you can cycle it away for 2. This is almost always just gonna be cycled away early, but then if you happen to draw it a little bit later in the game, when you have 6 mana, or at least are close to getting to 6 mana, it could just be a very bomby play that gives you a big reach dinosaur that gains you some incidental life, helps you win the race. It's nothing crazy, but it's decent. Next up, we've got Plow Through, 1 green mana for a sorcery. Choose one, destroy a vehicle, or target creature you control fights target creature and opponent controls. A 1 mana fight spell that doubles as just destroying a vehicle regardless of whether you have a creature you can fight with or not actually seems pretty good. 1 mana fight spell in general is going to be kind of good. So I guess that's why this is an uncommon and not a common. The versatility there and just the efficiency of a 1 mana piece of removal in the right deck is super good. You're going to pick this pretty high in green for your removal suite, and you're going to move on with your day. Next up, we've got Run Over, an instant for 1 green and 1. It costs 1 less to cast if it targets a mount or vehicle you control, which is interesting. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature and opponent controls. Now, what's important to note is you do have to crew the vehicle before you can target it with this and use it as the thing that's going to deal damage, because it can only target a creature you control. Even though it has the extra cost reduction if it targets a vehicle, it still has to target a creature. So that vehicle has to be turned into a creature before you can target it with this. And that's pretty easy to miss on first inspection, I think. That being said, just the fact that you can use this at instant speed with any of your creatures to just bite something and just kill it outright without having to risk it, without having to fight with it, is going to be pretty decent. And the fact that it's only going to be 1 mana at instant speed, which is the important part you shouldn't forget about. If you do happen to have a mount or vehicle you can target with this, makes it a lot better. In the mount or vehicle deck, this is going to be a slam dunk, but even outside of that, I think it will be pretty decent in filling in your removal suite in green. Next up, we've got Silken Strength. I think this is the last green card. 1 green and 1 for an enchantment aura with flash. It can enchant a creature or a vehicle, and when it enters, you untap the enchanted permanent. Enchanted permanent gets +1/+2 and reach. So this is used as like a combat trick, right? If you're being aggressive, swinging in with your creature or vehicle every single turn, and then your opponent thinks that they can race you and they're trying to crack back, well, now you flash this in after they declare attacks during combat, and you untap your dude, you block them, blow them out, kill it, and then you still get this buff and this reach that sticks around forever, and you can go back to swinging in every turn. I kind of love that. So pretty cool combat trick. It's nothing crazy. You're not going to pick this high, but if you're low on removal or combat tricks, this will absolutely flesh out your deck. Next up, we've got the multicolor cards. We've just got a couple of these today. First up is Broadside Barrage, an instant for 3 mana in the colors of Izzet. It deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and then you draw a card and discard a card. So instant speed removal in the colors of Izzet that can kill something with 5 toughness for 3 mana is pretty good by itself. And then the fact that it can loot is way better than it looks. When you first read this card, you think, okay, it loots, cool. But it's not just a loot, right? Because this set has so many ways to capitalize on discarding cards. So if you're playing this in the cycling deck, in the deck that has a lot of the discard payoffs, which are pretty much Grixis colored decks, and leaning more towards Izzet, to be honest. The best payoffs we had for discard are definitely in Izzet, and we do have some in black. The more you start to realize a card like this is nuts. If you're not only digging a card deeper towards your bomb while killing their 5 toughness creature, but also triggering every single discard synergy you have in the process without spending any extra mana, that's a lot of value in that deck. And even outside of that deck, if you just incidentally happen to be in the right colors, this is going to be a pretty good removal card for you. So I think this card is amazing. The cycling decks are going to pick this super, super high. And once you realize just how much value and how insane those decks end up being, you'll see why. But this card's just bananas. And that brings us to the last card of today, Ghastile Thrillseeker. This is a 2/3 Lizard Berserker for just 2 mana in the colors of Rakdos. It has Start Your Engines. When it enters, it deals 1 damage to target opponent and you gain a life. And at max speed, it has Death Touch and Haste. So if this comes down early, it can incidentally start your engines if you haven't been able to yet. Of course, you're going to want to try to start your engines on turn 1. But if you have this just a little bit later, it can just come down and immediately have Death Touch and Haste and swing in as a 2/3 Death Toucher as soon as you drop it for just the 2 mana, which is incredibly efficient in aggro. But more than that, it also drains a life when it enters. So it's almost like that first turn it swings, it's kind of swinging as a 3/3, except one of the damage happens even if they block, and even if they do block, you have Death Touch, so they lose their thing. There's just so much value packed into this that's really easy to overlook, and I kind of love it. Not only that, but it's even more lizard support. So in standard, in the lizard deck, you could play this, and that deck's already getting a lot of ways to just ping damage incidentally when you play lizards, and when you swing with lizards, and this can just synergize with all of those as well. So it really makes me think that Lizard Tribal might be worth upgrading and giving another shot. We've got a ton of crazy lizards still in standard from Bloomburrow, and that's exciting. But even just in the Start Your Engines deck, even if you're not going for Lizard Tribal, this could be really good. Just getting you an incidental drain and helping with your, Start Your Engines stuff. I kind of love it. I definitely think this card's going to be really powerful in just the right decks in Limited, and has a chance for sure in Standard. But that's going to do it for today, guys. Thank you guys so much for checking out the video. And remember, I've got a couple more key videos on the way. One where we talk about my top 10 for the set and briefly discuss maybe some of the deck ideas in which some of those cards will be used in. And then another video following hot on the heels of that one, which will detail the 10 decks I'm most excited to brew in early access. Because I have been invited to be back for early access. I will be playing this set for the first time on Wednesday, I believe February 5th. I'm going to be doing a 24-hour stream and not stopping until Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll see you there. I have a crazy crazy number of ridiculous, insane deck ideas I'm going to be running, and I think some of them are going to turn the standard meta on their head and be super competitive, so I'm really excited. And also, if you do catch that stream live, you'll be able to get me to try some of your ideas. If you have an idea about something you want to see if it works before you craft those cards, let me know. I'll run the idea, see if it works. Just stop by live Monday through Friday over on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/QuarantineCapricorn. Because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. Although right now I'm close to not breathing because I'm so tired. This video is so long. I need to wake up my dog and eat some dinner. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there, and if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.